Vacations are always fun. Being able to get away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life, and hopefully, being able to relax a bit. These stories, of course, are nothing like that. It's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Number 1. I grew up on the outskirts of a small southern town, and so I spent most days of my summer vacations prowling the woods close to my home. About a half-hour walk from my house, down dirt roads and overgrown deer trails, there was a sandy stretch of beach along a creek. Since it was so far removed from civilization, and I had never seen another soul there, I would often strip down naked and swim in the water to cool down in the summer sun. When I was a young girl, about 8 or 9 years old, I had gone down to my secret beach to go skinny dipping. I had spent all morning there, watching herons and splashing in the water happily. Suddenly, I began to hear the sounds of something large forcing its way through the undergrowth upstream. I was frozen, standing naked in the middle of the creek as 2 men emerged from the woods. They were much older than me, probably in their late 30s. Something about the way they were dressed scared me. Anyone who has spent a lot of time in the woods knows the dangers of thorn vines and brambles. But these guys were dressed in flip-flops, cargo shorts and wife beaters. They were filthy and covered in scratches across their arms and legs, looking as if hiking through the woods hadn't ever been on their agenda. I had left my clothes in an untidy pile on the bank, but to grab them, I would have had to move much closer to the men. As I frantically tried thinking of a way to get back to my clothes without alerting these guys, one of them turned and locked eyes with me. I grew up around southern manners, seeing as I was a naked little girl trying to cover myself with my hands as I stood there in the middle of a creek. I would have expected him to avert his gaze. But all he did was elbow his buddy in the ribs and point to me, and then whisper something beyond my hearing. When they both turned and began to advance towards me with their malicious grins on their faces, I officially lost my shit. Luckily, years of spending all my free time in the woods paid off. Forgetting modesty, I turned and ran at breakneck speed for the closest downstream deep channel. As I dove into the water, I could hear the men yelling and splashing behind me, trying desperately to catch up. I had always been at home in the water, and at this moment I swam as though my life depended on it, which it very well may have. I knew exactly where I needed to go. Earlier that summer, I had discovered what I thought as my secret hiding spot. The banks were rocky and sheer on both sides of the creek here, and the bend and downstream from the sandy beach. I had been watching muskrats swimming in the water, and had seen some swim through a hanging kudzu vine into what I thought was solid stone. Upon pulling back the vine and scaring the shit out of me and the muskrat in the process, I found an open space underneath an overhanging of rock. I had always loved hiding, and was immediately smitten with such a perfectly camouflaged spot. But weeks later, in this moment, I thought of it as my best hope. As I came close to my best spot, I ducked down and swam under to the hole in the stone. I only surfaced once I was safely behind the curtain of kudzu vines. I waited there for several minutes, trying to silence my heavy breathing and slow my rampaging heartbeat, until I heard the sounds of heavy crashing through the underbrush. I screamed a little, but thankfully had clamped a hand over my mouth to muffle it in time. As the sounds of snapping twigs and rustling leaves got closer, I could hear the men panting and cursing under their breath. It sounded as if they were walking on the edge of the bank a few feet above me, and they had moved down a ways. I heard a thud on the ground and a very angry yell, as if one of the men had tripped and fallen. Another voice shushed him and said something that made me tremble. "Shut up. She'll hear you." I had never been more terrified than at that moment. I cried silently, pressing my back against the rock and praying that they wouldn't find me. Even after I heard their footsteps continuing down the bank and into silence, I remained hidden behind the kudzu. I stayed there, delirious with fear and shivering in the water, until the sun had begun to dip low in the sky. I finally began to make my way back to my clothes and go home, picking my way along the deer trails that would let me move as silently as possible. When I had gotten to the beach, I stayed hidden in the undergrowth and watched for several minutes to make sure those two slime balls weren't anywhere around. Thankfully, although I found several footprints circling my clothes and pacing along the bank, the guys were nowhere to be seen. My shirt and jeans were still there, luckily, but my panties were gone. I threw my clothes on and ran the whole way home. I never told my mother about what happened at the creek, because I knew she would ban me from ever going into the woods again. I never saw those guys again, nor did I ever see anyone else down at that stretch of beach after that. Needless to say, without my mother telling me or not, I never went skinny dipping again. Number 2. Well, I went to Germany for a work trip. I say it in that way because it's company affiliated, but it was for a fun competition between several teams around Europe and the US. Our first night there, I went out with a buddy of mine, hitting a few small bars after dinner. I had a few beers, but was still pretty sober, and I was taking care of my friend who was pretty drunk. At the last bar, we each ordered a beer, and halfway through it I suddenly felt drunk. From sober to drunk, in half a beer, my mind must have already been messed up, because I basically ignored it, and I let my friend walk off back to the hotel by himself when he told me that he wanted to leave. In any ordinary situation, I would have gladly went with him back to the hotel. The next thing I know, I'm waking up on the sidewalk outside somewhere, with my wallet, with over 100 euros in it, and my cell phone gone. Pieces of what happened started to come back, and I see flashes of being held down on the ground by 3 or 4 people whilst they were taking my money. I'm pretty certain that the bartenders are responsible for drugging and robbing me. Afterwards, I remember finding a police station and trying to explain to them what happened, but they treated me like a drunken arsehole and told me to get lost, and literally pushed me out of the police station. I finally stumbled my way back to my hotel, although I have no idea how I made it, and I was in a very paranoid state. I eventually hit my bed and passed out for about 20 hours. Don't get robbed in Frankfurt. Number 3. I am a proud Floridian. At the time of this story in the early 2000s, I was going to college in South Florida and lived there with my family in my hometown in the Florida Panhandle. It's about a 7-hour drive up through Central Florida to get between the two places, so I mostly only went home for the holidays. It was Thanksgiving of my junior year, and I was excited that I had managed to rearrange my midterms to be able to leave campus 3 days ahead of everyone else, and I was expecting to beat the masses of traffic and was hoping for a quick vacation back home. My roommates wanted to have a last meal together before we all left. So I ate in the campus dining hall around 4 p.m, and I set off on my journey around 5:30. At around 10 p.m, I had just passed the 2/3 mark, where I always stopped at this little mum and pop type diner by the side of the highway to grab a snack and use the restroom, as well as to call my dad to let him know that I was okay, because I didn't have a cell phone yet. Well, I hadn't been there since summer, and the place unfortunately was out of business, so a little bummed out that I wasn't getting my chocolate chip pancakes, I just kept going. There wasn't really much built up around that area, so when I saw signs for a rest stop, of all the places in God's green earth, of some freaky town called Alachua, I went for it. So I went and parked directly under the streetlight for safety and used the facilities and called my dad. I didn't see anyone else there, except for a very exhausted looking woman who approached me asking me for directions, saying she was with her husband and 2 small children from Virginia, and they had made a wrong turn trying to get to Disney. So I left the rest area and was walking back to my car when I noticed a beat up, unmarked, grey or bluish work van parked this close to the driver's side of my '95 Honda Civic. Okay, I thought it was pretty weird. I had left Florida tags on it, so it couldn't have been the ladies who I spoke to in the bathroom. I distinctly remember that she said she was from Virginia. I turned around and hightailed it back to the rest stop, promptly running into some random middle-aged guy with 2 boys, and I started speaking to him. It turns out it was his wife that I'd spoken to, as she emerged from the bathroom a second later, and I felt comfortable speaking to him. I told him what was going on with the van, and how I didn't know what to do. He said he'd go check it out, so he left his kids with his wife and strutted up to the driver's side of the van. He stood there for a moment before speaking. His voice awkwardly quivered, but we could hear him yelling from where we were standing some 100 feet away. "Excuse me, gentlemen. We already called the police, so I'm going to have to politely suggest that you get out of here." And then he ran back to us, grabbed his wife and kids, pointed to me with a swift "you," and said, "Come on, let's all get into the car now." And we all ran together. So here I was, confusedly sitting in the back of this stranger's SUV, whilst he went to use the payphone to presumably call the police. Meanwhile, the van peeled out of there, like I'd never seen anyone get the hell out of there so quickly. They ran up on the curve on their way out, and they burned rubber. It was almost comical. The cops got there, and I found out what happened. The man went to check out on the van, and he could see in it pretty well because I had parked under the streetlight. The first thing he noticed was that all the seats except the driver's seats had been removed, and there was this guy sitting in the driver's seat and a guy sitting in the back, a tarp laid out on the back, and a bunch of other random items that he couldn't immediately identify. Neither of the guys were reading a newspaper or map or anything, and they were just both apparently just sitting there. It still makes me sick just thinking about it, and what their intentions were for me. Number 4. I was studying abroad in Thailand and went with a friend to an island, Koh Samui, for the weekend. Soon after checking into our dinky hotel, we rented motorbikes and cruised around the island, quickly getting lost on the back roads. No big deal. We found a tiki bar and drank the night away, thinking, we'll figure out how to get home eventually. We had drunk enough that motorbiking back to wherever the hell we came from suddenly seemed like a good idea. It's an island, right? Who can get lost on an island? So we set back in the general direction of the hotel. And after about an hour of zigzagging around dirt roads, we passed something that smelled terrible, and I turned back to make a sour face at my friend. In a flash, I was on the side of the road and smashed the motorbike off the embankment into what I assumed was a swamp of the town's sewage. By the time I realized what happened, I was almost fully submerged and trying to account for my body parts, let alone wipe my face and mouth clear of the revolting slush. I scrambled out, scratched, bruised, and shamed, but all in one piece. The motorbike was stuck, half submerged, so we yanked it out and somehow got it running again, and then limped back towards our hotel. We eventually made it back, but it must have been at least 3 a.m. I stunk of shit and had a plethora of scratches and bruises that had been marinating for over an hour now. So I sprinted to my hotel room and showered like my life depended on it. After a few minutes of obsessive scrubbing, I emerged to an empty room, no friend in sight, so I went over to my suitcase to get dressed and look for him. It was practically empty, save a few t-shirts and underwear. Strange? I went for my backpack, and it was nowhere in sight. My friend's backpack, not there. We were robbed. Frantically, I threw on a shirt and underwear, and ran outside to find my friend banging on the door to the lobby. They were already aware that our stuff was missing. Feeling drunk and hungover and violated in multiple ways, I sprinted over and joined him, banging and throwing rocks at the window until somebody responded and helped us report this crime. Before long, a little old Thai man poked his head around the corner of the building. We yelled for his attention and he darted away. We chased, then he reappeared, this time wielding a machete. We let out a massive, "Holy shit," and he shouted something in Thai. Then we bolted as far as we could from the property, running until we were absolutely certain he couldn't find us. We ended up far away at another beach resort. Me, Winnie the Poohing in my t-shirt and underwear, and my friend, gross from a long day of motorbiking and swamp wadding, had no idea what to do. We had no hotel, no passports, no clothes, and our wallets and phones were back at the recently robbed hotel room, where a little old man was waiting for us with his machete. Defeated, we passed out on the resort's beach chairs and allowed the mosquitoes to feast on our helpless bodies until the sun rose. That morning, we limped back to the hotel, snuck into the room, and grabbed what was left of our possessions. Thankfully, it wasn't robbed twice and our wallets were safe. I bought a bathing suit to wear over my underwear, and to this day, it remains my most horrible vacation experience. Number 5. I spent a week in New York City with some close friends. We headed over to Times Square to see the sights and whatnot, then decided to check out the mall that we spotted. Surprisingly, the mall was nothing special. I expected everything in New York to be top-notch, but this mall turned out to be just as shitty as any other mall. Several of the stores were closed, and it looked like the whole place was under renovation. Anyway, I needed to use the restroom. Right when I get into the stall, I hear a very angry man shouting and slamming the doors on the other stall. He's screaming shit like, "Where are you?" and making a big ruckus, and stops at my stall. My god, it was the creepiest thing ever. I turn around to see a hand clutch the top of the stall, and he tries to pull the door down as hard as he possibly can. I can see his face. He looks like a cross between the Unabomber and Dale from King of the Hill. I'm standing there mid-wipe, terrified this guy is gonna knife me or something. So many thoughts running through my head. What do I do? Is he armed? Does he have a disease? Could I take this guy? Thankfully, I heard a loud booming voice say, "You better step away from that stall. That guy in there is gonna mess you up." It was an NYPD officer. I have never been so happy to see a police officer. I hurried back to my friends and retell the story, but one of them starts to mock me. Haha, Potato almost got raped. And then the NYPD drags the perverted guy through the mall, and my friends catch a glimpse. I've been told the look on my face was priceless, and they immediately tried to reassure me that I could have taken him if it came to it. In the words of my friend, "When I saw the look on your face, I knew that you'd seen enough of New York." Number 6. I was walking down the stairs to the subway in Korea when I noticed a bunch of cameramen rushing by. Curious, I walked back up to see what all the commotion is about. I realize that there are some celebrities, so I stick around. I didn't understand everything they said, but they said to go to this one place for the Olympics for some sort of event. It was late at night, but I wanted to join the fun, so I decided to go. I arrive at the subway stop and realize I don't know where the hell to go. And at this time, the subway is beginning to shut down, so I can't go back home. Realizing my stupidity, I decided to go to the ATM to grab money in case I needed a taxi later. However, I was withdrawing money at around 11:55 at a train station, and as the money was processing, it hit midnight. And apparently those damn machines close at that time, so the money never comes out. I freaked out, not knowing what to do, because I thought I'd just lost $200. I try calling the ATM people, and they say they'll call about 15 minutes later. So I sit on the floor waiting in a virtually empty station. Then this man around his late 30s to mid 40s comes over. I'm only 17, mind you, with a friendly smile. I assume he works for the train station, so I explain my problem in broken Korean, and he nods. I get a call back from the ATM people, who have very good English, and they tell me to wait a little while longer. When I hang up, the man's expression suddenly changes from nice and caring to devious. He then proceeds to ask me if I want to drink something with him. However, I mix up the word alcohol, sul, with water, mul, and I think he is asking for some water. I give him a confused look, and then proceed to pull out my half-empty water bottle and offer it to him. He looks at it for a second and begins to laugh, and then proceeds to explain that he wants to buy me alcohol. I give him a dumbfounded look, and I just explain to him that I lost my money, and I say I don't have any money. He then proceeds to tell me it's okay, and that he has money. Being bad at confrontations, I just paused for a really long time. Then he asks me, "You don't want to?" I look at him like he's an idiot, because really, I'm going to go drinking with an old stranger. In my head I'm like, no way, but I just say, "Yeah, I don't want to go." Then he leaves, but before doing so, puts his hands on my folded arm and slides it over as he's leaving. It was highly unpleasant. Not knowing what to do, I decide to find the place that the event was talking about. I walk down the streets with very few people and get really scared, so I begin running and ask some nice looking people where I may find the location. I finally found it, and the event turns out to be lame anyway. Later, I am picked up by someone at around 2 AM, and they tell me that the place I am in is rather dangerous because that's where all the prostitutes are. Then he proceeds to drive me down the street full of prostitutes to show me, and it's awkward as hell. But that's when I realized what a dangerous situation I put myself in. That's when I also realized why the guy was asking me for a drink. He probably thought I was a prostitute. Not that I was dressed like one anyway. Oh, and for those of you curious, I later got a call from the ATM person, informing me that the transactions ended up cancelling and the $200 was still in my account. However, that meant I was without cash for that night. Number 7. I had just married my current wife. She had a daughter in middle school. I had bought a camper a few months earlier. So me, my new wife and my new 13-year-old stepdaughter and a friend of hers headed to the mountains with our 2 dogs. We were in an SUV, pulling the camper. It is hot down in town, but it was cool, and in the 70s at the camp. There is another dog running around the campground, so I tell my dogs to lay down in the back of the SUV. They're both very well behaved. I left the gate up, and the SUV was turned off. Even though both dogs were in goodish health and very active, the oldest, Janine, was 14 years old. Keep in mind that my stepdaughter was 13. We had been there for about 15 minutes, and my stepdaughter's friend says that Janine isn't moving. She was dead. Here we are, 5 hours from our home on our first vacation, and 15 minutes in, the family pet dies. Everyone flips naturally. My wife is screaming and wants me to do something. My stepdaughter is screaming, no. What to do? Well, after an hour of that, I get everyone calmed down. So we start talking about what to do with her. My wife decided she wanted her buried in the mountains, so I go down to the office and ask the owner if I can borrow a shovel. This is obviously a strange request, and he asked me why. I told him why, and even though he is a super nice guy, he didn't know me or the circumstances, so he says he didn't want for me to get in trouble for anything, and he doesn't want me burying the dog on his property. He tells me that there is a vet down the street, and that I can just drop the dog off outside, and that the vet would take care of it for me. So I go back and tell my wife. She says that's okay, but she wanted to know what the vet is going to do to her. I call the vet and leave him a message as it's after hours. He calls me back pretty quickly, and he tells me that he could take care of it, but begins to tell me the prices. He tells me bury versus cremate, and it was expensive. We were already on a tight budget, as it was the first day of a week-long vacation, so I told him we would let him know. My wife and I discussed it, and decided we didn't want to spend the money, so back to the office I go. I talk to the owner again, and tell him what the vet had said. I tell him that I will wait until after dark and go off the property to bury the dog. He agrees and gives me a shovel. By this time it is almost dark, and the dog was already starting to smell. She had a shit in the SUV during death, so around 9 PM I head out, dead dog and shovel in tow, and start driving around looking for a good spot. My wife told me that it needed to be somewhere that we could visit, so off I go. To be honest, I was not looking forward enough to digging a hole big enough to bury my 85-pound dog. I briefly considered leaving her besides the road in the woods somewhere, but didn't want to disrespect my wife's wishes, and all I could think of was throwing her off the side of the mountain in the dark, and my wife seeing her next morning in the middle of a road below where I had thrown her out whilst we were heading down the next morning. Finally, I remember a Christmas tree farm down the road, so I find the farm and walk up the side of a mountain, quite a way I might add, and realise that I don't have a flashlight. I find a nice spot a few hundred yards from the road and start digging. It takes a while. I go back down and get the dog and head back up the mountain. I can't find the hole I dug. Finally, after several minutes of walking around carrying this heavy stinky dog, I find the hole by falling in it. It was about 4 feet deep, It was very, very dark. So she was buried, collar removed, and after locating a car wash with a carpet cleaner and lots of air freshener, I spent an hour trying to get the smell of dead dog out of the car. I didn't realize they started to smell so fast. I get back around 1 a.m, totally exhausted, and the next morning I get up and everyone is very down. I cook breakfast to try and cheer everyone up, and after breakfast, my wife says that we should go see where I buried her. So we get in the SUV and head down the mountain. I start slowing down when we approach Christmas Tree Farm, and we go around the curve and we look up the mountain. Cops everywhere. I had buried the dog in the owner of Christmas Tree Farm's front yard. I step on the gas and we get out of there, never to return. Number 8. In my early 20s, I was very dumb and very lonely. I had just discovered the joy of using chat rooms and such, and thought it was great that I was meeting girls from all over the world. One of these was from the US, and I decided, despite every single indication that this was a really stupid idea, that I would go visit her on a vacation. We spoke about it, and it was agreed that I would be staying with her aunt. After a long flight, I touched down and made my way through the US airport security system. I waited in the lobby and waited and waited, and after a while, I decided to use some change to call a number that I had been given, where the aunt explained that they weren't coming to collect me and that I should get the bus. I explained that I had no idea where the bus was, which one to get on, and where to get off. They gave me an address, and I got a taxi. The driver was cool. He gave me cigarettes and was really nice to me, but he didn't speak English very well, and had no idea where he was going. He kept calling dispatch and asked for directions, and the guy on the radio was clearly getting extremely irritated and having to spell out the entire route for him. Eventually we got there, and it was a very long way away from the airport and cost me over $300. I had also discovered that the airline had smashed my guitar. The family greeted me and gave me some pizza and showed me around. However, there was no sign of the girl that I was supposed to be meeting. They called her to let her know that I was there, but she didn't show. She eventually came over sometime the next day for a brief visit, but I knew from the first minute that I had made a huge mistake. She clearly didn't want me to be there at all. I was due to stay for around 3 weeks, most of which was spent hanging around with this girl's aunt and her aunt's cool boyfriend and kids. I rarely saw the girl, and she made almost no effort to speak to me. I basically spent 3 weeks washing dishes and smoking. I had previously agreed to pay some rent for my stay, but the aunt actually used me to pay for her groceries too, and I basically spent the majority of my money on them. Occasionally, a second aunt would be hanging around the house. She was wacky, and it transpired that she had a psychotic ex-husband that followed her around in his truck and threatened her all the time. Guess who kept calling the house? They kept winding the guy up by picking the phone up, giggling, and hanging up until eventually they gave it to me and told me to tell him that nobody was home. The conversations went like this. Me. Hello. Him. Put her on the phone. Me. Nobody's home. They've all gone out to eat. Him. Who the hell is this? Me. It's Jim. Him. The faggot from London? Me. I'm not from London. Him. Put her on the phone. And it would be like this until he started getting incredibly aggressive and threatening to come over and murder me. Or, as he liked to put it, gut me like a fish. They decided that the best course of action was that we should all immediately go to KFC. So I'm eating my chicken, and thinking about how I'm potentially going to have a few speed holes in my sternum by sunrise. Then I see a police helicopter circling right where we are, with its lights on, and a voice booms out, "Drop the gun, you are surrounded." It wasn't the guy, but holy shit, I almost dropped a loaf. Anyway, over the course of the next few days, the girl was increasingly insensitive to me, and I was losing my mind. Her family kept telling me all sorts of stories about how she was a whore and how she did this to people all the time. They would wait for me to tell her that she couldn't come over because she was out somewhere, and then they would drive by her house to see that her car was still in her driveway and come back to tell me that she was just full of shit. And it was like they were all using me to get at each other, and I just didn't know who was telling the truth. I just wanted to go home. Eventually I totally fell out with her, and she gets banned from the apartment for getting caught smoking pot by the owner of the building. Her aunt tells me how much of a piece of shit she is, and how she's done with her, etc, etc. Until one night I went to bed early, and I was awoken in the middle of the night by two people cackling loudly. I go out into the hall in my boxers, and I see the aunt and this girl merrily arsing about on the internet and laughing their asses off. I look at them in utter disbelief and stormed off into the kitchen, made a drink, slammed a few doors, and went back to sleep. I was woken up again by a knocking at my door. I opened it to find the aunt's boyfriend. He asked me what the hell was going on, because he'd just been called up by them to come over and kick my ass. He said he knew it was all bullshit, but he had to come anyway. There was nobody else in the house, so we went outside for a smoke. After a few minutes he said, "Hey, that's them over there." They were across from the complex in a security car. They had called security on me. I just said, "Right, that's the last straw, man, I'm done," and I went back to pack. And when I came out, the security guys were there waiting to take my statement. He said that the women told them that I had become violent, was naked in front of her children, and had a knife. I had bought a small folding knife in the presentation box from a sports store because I collected them. It was in a box, locked inside my suitcase in a cupboard. I'm surprised the guy didn't kick the door in or shoot me in the ass. And after explaining the entire trip to the security guard, the guy just looked at me, smiled and said, "Listen, you're a really nice guy, but you've just got involved with some really messed up people. But basically, in this state, a woman's word is gold, and a court will believe any shit she sells them. If I were you, I'd get out of here right now." I said, "Mate, you don't even have to suggest it, I'm gone." And the boyfriend drove me to a motel where I had to stay on my own for 2 days before going to the airport and being charged £200 for the pleasure of changing my flight date. It was Virgin Atlantic. I even saw Richard Branson in the airport when I got back. I should have wrestled the swine to the ground and made him eat the remains of my guitar and the £200 receipt. Moral of the story, kids, don't be stupid and internet. Number 9. When I was in middle school, my dad got involved in a community service project. I tagged along for the experience. The project involved teaching Native Americans on a tiny island off the coast of Panama. The island consisted of a ton of densely packed, thatched huts, surrounded by a ring of patchwork tinned outhouses that emptied into the ocean. After about a week of grueling teaching sessions in the sweltering heat of a schoolhouse, the project culminated in a huge festival in the village that lasted hours into the night. At long last, dinner was served, fresh fish caught just offshore to be picked through sand utensils, just like every other night. The tiring event drew to a close, and my dad and I wandered back to the hut that we were staying in. Then it arrived. The gurgling. That I need the bathroom right now feeling that hits with the impact of a freight train, eyes wide, and sweat beginning to form. I informed my dad that we would be heading back to our hut as fast as possible, with a detour at the nearest outhouse. An excruciating minute or two later, I was seated behind a piece of scrap metal on a bucket with a hole cut out, pouring sweet horrors back into the waters from which they came. And I began to realize that the island's fishing and sewage systems were far too closely situated to be entirely healthy. And infinite trips back and forth, or so they were in the mind of a 13-year-old, from the shack where I was poisoning the ocean, to the hut where I was enjoying the full benefit of modern medicine, namely a wet washcloth. Tropical island, tropical disease, a stinging torrent of, "Oh God, when will it end?" gushing from both sides of my body. Hours in, I was finally able to drift off to much-needed sleep. At last, able to put the intestine-twisting ravages of serious dysentery behind me. And then things got strange. At 4 o'clock in the morning, I suddenly reverted to consciousness. And this time, it wasn't my nausea at fault. A heart-stopping cacophony of some sort erupted from the center of the village. I laugh now, but I was crying desperately, with tired tears of confusion at the time. Riot, revolution, guns, explosions, death, music? It was the marching band. Tropical, Caribbean island, the size of a football field, and the thing that disturbs me from the worst disease I've ever suffered, barely an hour into the most relieving sleep of my life, was the freaking godforsaken marching band. My dad, between peals of laughter and obliviousness to my protracted suffering, grabbed his flashlight and rushed out to investigate. Turns out it was completely normal. The Island Drum Corps had a Friday morning band practice in preparation for the regional competition this coming weekend. Practice was obviously held at 4 in the morning. They marched around banging like the world was over for a solid hour before allowing me a moment's rest, with a fever upwards of 100 degrees and a whole host of stomach-related symptoms. I could barely understand what was happening. What I did understand was that it was easily the most miserable I've been whilst travelling, and that it was the only beginning of the strangest day of my life. Number 10. I was in China for a study abroad trip. I signed up for a tour to Inner Mongolia, which was only $60, so I couldn't resist. Here's what the tour included. I took a tour of a sweatshop. At first it seemed nice. There were people knitting scarves in well-ventilated rooms. But then, as the tour progressed, we saw things get worse and worse. The final leg of the tour, we saw people grinding tusks into jewellery in 100-degree heat with no ventilation. Once the tour ended, we got to see the most messed up thing of them all, the sweatshop gift shop. We got to buy things these poor workers had slaved for hours making at a discount. Before getting on the tour, we were told that we would be in a large bus. It wasn't. It was more like a Volkswagen minivan, and I was sitting in a very uncomfortable position. My legs were cramped, up against the suitcases in front of me for 10 hours. But that was just getting into Inner Mongolia. On the ride back, me and my fellow travellers experienced the 7 circles of hell, aka the 7 circles of Beijing. You'll never appreciate how huge Beijing is until you get there from Inner Mongolia, cramped in a minivan. At first we thought, finally, we're in Beijing. This horrible trip is over. But like I said, Beijing is colossal. Once you're in Beijing, it'll be at least another 3 hours until you're in the place in Beijing where you started from. Also, Inner Mongolia was the first place where I experienced racial discrimination. I was in a little town called Hu Hot. I wanted to buy a Chairman Mao trinket, but they refused to sell it to me because I'm white. So not worth the $60. Number 11. This year, on the train from Rome to Florence, I was sitting across from these two short Italian ladies. One of them was maybe 45, and the other one at least 70. They looked similar, so I assumed they were mother and daughter. When they sat down, they tried to speak to me in Italian, but I don't speak any, so I just smiled and apologized. Since I was pretty tired, I tried to fall asleep. As I was doing so, they had a conversation that was getting more and more animated, which I realized was soon becoming an argument. It escalated quickly, and the next thing I knew, they're slapping and elbowing each other. The young one gets up and storms off, and the older lady sits, fuming. Now that it's quiet, I fall asleep. I wake up once during the ride, and now the old lady is gone, and the young lady is there. She's got a pad of paper and a pencil out, and I notice that she's staring at me. She doesn't notice I'm awake yet, so I can clearly see that she's drawing me. I cough and sit up, and she hastily clutches the notebook to her chest, looking very nervous. When I lean my head back and fall asleep again, she resumes. Whatever. I wake up to something wet on my feet. I look up, and the older woman, who is back now, is standing over me, pouring a bottle of water on my feet. I look up at her and not sure how to respond, but she just smiles and finishes emptying it, shaking the last few drops out on my now soaked shoes. She sits back down next to her daughter. The journey continues in complete silence until a few minutes later, when it's my stop. I still have no idea what happened. Number 12. I was waiting in a hostel in southern France to open. An old man is staring at me. I enthusiastically chat back, trying to practice my French. In the span of 30 seconds, he starts asking what kind of underwear I'm wearing. Then he starts asking me if I would like to masturbate with him. Then he tries to take off my shirt. I'm a guy, by the way. I yell at him and run away. Ladies, I now understand what you have to go through. The hostel opens, and I try to explain in my best French that there is a pervert hanging around there. When I realized, I did not know the word for pervert or masturbate. I just said, disgusting man, and then gestured masturbation. The woman at the hostel was furious. She started yelling at me, and I couldn't understand. She didn't want to give me a room. A boy working there managed to convince her to rent me a bed though. Embarrassed, tired, and disgusted, I went to the shower. The showers were outside the dorm. No one was around, so I just went in there with my small travel towel and took my toiletries. After a freezing shower, I went back to the room to discover that I had forgotten my key, and of course I'd been locked out. No one is around. I am wearing just a towel, and finally, I realize I have no choice but to go ask the front desk for a key. I go downstairs in my towel, and no one is there. Desperate, I go outside in a tiny towel and look for anyone. The entire staff is in the dining room, with an entire Swiss marching band. Fortunately, the angry French lady is near the door, and I gesture for her to come over. She immediately starts yelling at me, drawing the attention of 100 or something people to a guy in a towel. Merde. I try to explain that I forgot my key, and she keeps yelling. She must think I'm some crazy perverted dude trying to flash everyone. Finally, she gives me a key, and I ended up getting drunk with the Swiss that night. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I'm glad none of my vacations have been like that. Have any of you guys ever had something horrific happen to you whilst on vacation? I would love to hear about it. If you enjoyed today's video, please consider dropping a like and leaving a comment. It would really help me out with that pesky YouTube algorithm. Thanks guys. And if you would like your story read on my channel, you can submit it as a text post to my Reddit page, or send it to me via email. Both links can be found in the description. And if you would like to do something truly amazing today to help support the channel, you now can via Patreon. You can find the link in the description, as well as the links to my social media. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.